Hello friends, I'm Kendra Winchester. Welcome back to my channel. And today I'm going to be talking about my favorite books for 2022. Yes, this is a year late. Yes, all of these books I read a year ago. What's interesting about today is something I've never done before, which is kind of make this list after time has gone by, right? So when I made the video, my favorite books of the year so far, in the middle of 2022, I made a list. And then at the end of 2022, in my Hobonichi, I made another list. There was zero overlap between those books. But making this list, it was a different list. So that is a very interesting situation, a very interesting experiment. So I have brought to you today the list that I've created as me, 2020, I guess 2024 Kendra, thinking back on 2022, and I'm very, very happy with it. So I have ranked them. And we're gonna jump in, and these are again in order, which I normally don't do, but I've done it for both. I'm doing it for both 2022 and 23 this year. So okay, so I always try to put something like the representation of my favorite young people's literature title. And this year was Omar Rising by Aisha Saeed. This is the same author as Amal Unbound. This is a very short middle grade novel about Omar, who gets a scholarship to go to this boys' school, but he finds that as a scholarship student, he not only has to work as like a work scholarship, but he also has to maintain perfect grades, which is almost impossible for him and the other students who are on the scholarship. And so yeah, it's a very difficult, like it tackles a difficult topic. Aisha Saeed is great about writing middle grade books about difficult topics. This is one that I feel like is so well done. This is set in Pakistan. So this is a companion novel to Amal Unbound as opposed to like a strict sequel, but I feel like it's so well done. Gorgeous cover. I just really enjoyed it, and it was definitely my favorite middle grade or YA book of 2022. One of my favorite memoirs with this book I have been waiting for ages, and that is Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. This is a memoir that Ashley has written really about her relationship with her parents. And I've seen a back and forth about like which parent she's referencing, but I feel that it is a reference to both. So Ashley is a Black woman whose father was incarcerated, and so she grew up not really understanding why he was incarcerated, and so there's the moment she learns why, and her relationship with her mother is really difficult, and she begins the memoir with this scene where her mother calls her, and Ashley C. Ford has just this beautiful way of writing, this way of crafting scenes and leading the reader through her life in such a distinct way. It was such a phenomenal memoir. It did not disappoint. It's so good, and I wish more people were still talking about it in 2024 now. So like, if you haven't picked this up, definitely prioritize. She's such an incredible writer, and yeah, I've not stopped thinking about this book since I finished it. So last year, it's 2024 now, in 2022, I read a lot of craft books, a lot of writing craft books, prepping to write my nonfiction manuscript in 2023. I ended up taking a class, so I guess that was successful, but I wanted to pick like a representative of my favorite craft book. Now, The Art of Memoir was on the second list that I made, but I think that this book, which was also on the list, is the one that I think of the most, and this is The Writing Life by Annie Dillard. I had an intern in 2021 and a part of 2022 that really loves Annie Dillard, obsessed, and so I've read 2 books by Annie Dillard. I read one last year, one this year, and I much preferred this one. Pilgrim at Tinker Creek is great, but I have a phobia of parasites, so if you also have one, don't read Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, because Annie Dillard loves parasites. I don't understand Annie. Anyway, Annie Dillard, excellent writer. This is written closer to more so at the end of her career as opposed to the beginning of her career. And she just has a lot of thoughts on writing, and her sentences are just disgustingly good in all of the best ways. Absolutely love this book. I always like also to have a representative from the Appalachian side of things. I do whole lists and roundups of Appalachian books, so I will link the ones I did in 2022 in the description box. But I think a great representative of that is Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place by Nima Avashia. Nima is a great literary citizen. I love her as a person. We are online friends. We've never met in person. I cannot wait to meet her in person. But she is such an incredible writer, and she wrote this memoir about growing up as an Indian American woman in this tiny town in West Virginia. These essays, more so essays, are about her coming to terms with being a queer Indian woman from West Virginia and having such a supportive community that has such great community care and support. And at the same time, when 2016 rolls around, these people that she loves, that she grew up with, that she looked up to, are posting horrific things about immigrants on their social media. She's like, well, I'm an immigrant, like my family's from India. And they're like, oh, well, not you. It's such a beautiful collection. Absolutely love it. Definitely check it out if you haven't already. Just a fabulous book, and one of the most important books to come out of Appalachia in a long time. How to introduce this book, because I love it, obviously, but one of the reasons I love it is because in the world of chronic illness and disability, I see Susan Sontag everywhere. She talks about disability as metaphor and all sorts of stuff. Like, I am not a fan of her disability writing, but one of the things that frustrates me is that Audre Lorde has written an incredible book called The Cancer Journals that is intensely better than that book, and I don't see as many people talking about it. So, The Cancer Journals by Audre Lorde. She gets breast cancer, right? And so she talks about being a queer Black woman who chooses not to wear a prosthetic. She has, her breasts removed. I can't remember it's one or both, but she refuses to wear a prosthetic. And all of the nurses are like, why aren't you wearing one? This makes people uncomfortable if you don't wear one. She's like, why? And it's like performing these non-disabled, non-ill qualities that she really bumps up against. And she talks about how there is a performance, there is how non-disabled people are so uncomfortable with illness that they want her to pretend like she's never been sick. It's so good. It's so deeply impactful. This should be the cornerstone on which that we are building disability writing instead of that other person. I am not here to argue about that today. We are here to celebrate Audre Lorde. If you'd like to argue about that on a different day, you can DM me or something. But today, in the comments, we should be celebrating Audre Lorde. I'm just explaining my personal feelings. Speaking of personal feelings about disability, I loved Year of the Tiger, An Activist Life by Alice Wong. One of the things that I love about this memoir is that Alice Wong uses a multimedia format to communicate her life. There are interviews, there are photos, there are like screenshots of her social media, there are transcripts from interviews that she's done. There's screenshots of text messages. Like, this is a multimedia kind of communication, and this is honestly how I have discovered that a lot of disabled people communicate, because so oftentimes when we communicate as someone who can't read text, like for example, I am expected to find a way to not inconvenience the people who can, right? And so anytime I tell someone that something is easier, there's like this guilt that I feel like I'm supposed to comfort them about, and that is frustrating. But in this, there is no catering to non-disabled people or folks who can communicate in all of the regular ways, whatever you want to call it. She just communicates her story and the way that she feels is the best way to do it. And I love that. I love that it's multimedia. I send way more photos than the average person, for example. And so when I see all her photos and her text messages and like all of this, I feel seen, and I feel that she's celebrating disabled people and the stories that we tell and the lives that we live and how we tell our stories. So I just really love this. And I felt very seen in a lot of ways, even though, you know, Alice Wong and I come from very different communities, very different disability communities, but there is that universality of that shared experience of living in a world that is not made for disabled people of any kind. So if you haven't read this already, please go do so. Alice Wong is such a brilliant activist and just such a good, so good at her job. I interviewed her when her anthology Disability Visibility came out. She edited this anthology of writing, and also she has a new anthology coming out in 2024. Stay tuned. It's about intimacy and disability, which I am very excited about. My memory card just died, so let's start from the top with this one. So when I first started thinking about this book, and I love this book, I was like, oh, it's just because I recently read it, right? It's just because of that proximity kind of bias that you have. But I kept thinking about it, and I saw reviews of this book, and not everyone loved it. Some people did, but it was kind of mixed reviews. But I adored this book. So I think it's been almost 2 years since I read the book. I feel like it's safe to say it's no longer proximity bias. But that is Fiona and Jane by Jean Chen-Ho. This is the dark horse, the surprise of the year for 2022. This is somewhere between a novel and Link short story collections. There's like a Link short stories. I don't know what it is, but I love it anyway. So this is about Fiona and Jane, like it says on the tin. They're from two very different Asian American backgrounds, two different family backgrounds, and it's about their relationship over the course of years. So usually a short story is from one perspective, and then we jump here and there. The voices to me are very distinct, and I can tell the difference. I didn't even need to hear, like they said one narrator for the whole audiobook, so, and I'll put a name of the narrator here, but I didn't even need to hear who it was or anything about it. The style of the different perspectives is so different. Some people have thought they were very similar, so like fair, but like to me they were very different. And there's a story, one of them has a really difficult relationship with her father, and like, what's that about? Difficult relationship with their mother. They have difficult relationships with each other. Like, it's just something that I really appreciate, especially at this place in my life where I've had people come in and out of my lives. Relationships are very different. Friendships are different. And was so beautiful. Unexpected. Loved it. Cannot wait for her next book. So now we are in the top 3. I read this book over Thanksgiving. I try to read a book by an Indigenous author over the course of American Thanksgiving for obvious reasons. It's also Indigenous Peoples Month for November here in the United States. And so in 2022, I picked up Tanya Talaga's 7 Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City. And this is set in Ontario. So this is about an Indigenous woman who is a journalist, and she goes and first starts reporting on these Indigenous students who died from 2000 to 2011. There were 7 Indigenous students who died in Thunder Bay, Ontario. But they were hundreds of miles away from their families because of that there was not a school in their Native Nations proximity for them to go to for high school. So they had to travel all the way far away from their rural northern communities to a city, and that is very overwhelming. But what she does is she rewinds everything and goes back to the residential schools at the time. Way back, I think one of the ones that she looks at is like, is it in the 60s? It's decades earlier, where a young boy is found dead because he had fled the school. So what she does is she ties together these threads of how the Indigenous residential schools in Ontario really led to these students dying over the course of this decade that she's following. She talks about how when they finally closed all the residential schools, for example, there was no school system in place for these Native nations, so they often had to hold school in these places that were representatives of horrible trauma. There was no place, no structures built for these students' education, so they ended up having to send them to indigenous schools in cities, and these are kids from very rural, isolated areas. They're separated from their communities, their families. They're with like host families a lot of the time. And for me, even though I am not from Canada, we obviously also have those horrific residential schools here in the United States. But for me, what she does is firmly tie together the process and how everything is connected, of how these residential schools led to where we are today, how this horrific things that have happened across North America led to these students' circumstances, and how the residential schools have had such an intense, long-lasting effect in communities. And these schools closed, some of them, a lot later than you would think. So obviously a lot of content warnings for racism and the violence of settler colonialism and so many other things, for mental health, for suicidal ideation, death by suicide. So just as a heads up, there's also an audiobook performed by the person I'll put on the screen. So if that's something that you need to access the book, definitely go check it out. I think I found it on Hoopla or Scribd, now Everand. I can't remember, but it is available as an audiobook in the United States if you are in the US like I am. All right, the last two books. My favorites of the year, and one is my favorite audio book of the year, and one is my favorite book overall of the year. So I guess we'll just jump in. My favorite audiobook of the year is 10 Steps to Tonette by Hannah Gadsby, a memoir situation. This is performed by the author. Hannah Gadsby is a queer, autistic, gender non-conforming comedian, and in Tonette, she famously quit comedy, and it was one of the most incredible performances I've ever seen. You can find it on Netflix. She also has another one called Douglas, and then her most recent one is a little happier. She got married during the pandemic, so you know, congrats to her. But this is her memoir, and this is such an incredible book and a well-performed book as an audiobook. It was just hands down this book that I had on my most anticipated for years once I heard that this deal for this book went through. And it is an incredible book, and she talks about growing up in Tasmania. I love this book because she talks about being an autistic adult when she was diagnosed with autism, and talking about how so many different psychologists tried to diagnose her with personality disorders. But I mean, that was the time, you know, she's a decade older than I am, so she was certainly not diagnosed as an autistic girl. That's not something that happened. That barely happened with boys at the time, you know, especially the type of how her access needs kind of manifest. And so she talks about being aware that something about her was different, but not completely understanding. And that is such a common experience with autistic women, especially those diagnosed as adults. And so I really appreciated it. I really appreciated her comedy. She told this story with so much heart and love, and it was such a great performance as well. I absolutely loved it. This is one of the books that I recommend when people are wanting to read more from autistic writers. So definitely check this out, and check out Tonette on Netflix. I feel like watching that first and then reading this would probably be the way to go, so you know, I feel like you will get a more fuller experience from the memoir, but you certainly don't have to, because she walks you through it. So that's great. So love this. Okay, so my favorite book of the year is really hard for me to describe because I get so excited about it, and I still love it, and I still think about it all the time. But my favorite book of 2022, to be specific, is South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation by Imani Perry. So I'm going to read you a quote here that is just stunning. The consequences of the projection of national sins, and specifically racism, onto one region is a misnarration of history and American identity. The consequence of truncating the South and relegating it to a backwards corner is a misapprehension of its power in American history. Paying attention to the South, its past, its dance, its presence, its threatening future, and most of all, how it moves the rest of the country about, allows us to understand much more about our nation and about how our people, land, commerce work in relation to one another, often cruelly, and about how our tastes and ways flow from our habits. I try to explain, but I'm impious in my movements. I passed over many famous places and lingered in unusual ones. I was fascinated and sometimes furious at the sons of the Confederacy. I love my people without apology. My son Issa has warned me about the danger of making things look too beautiful. To be beautiful, it must be truthful. And the truth is often ugly. But it's funny too, and strange, also morbid. This is a collection, but it's also an excision, a pruning, like we might do to a plant in order to extend its life. Most of all, please remember, while this book is not a history, it is a true story. This book is a look at the South in a way that I've never read before. Monty Perry, a Black academic woman, travels. She's originally from Alabama. Her family's from Alabama. And so she takes us on a little tour of the South, and each stop kind of moves us forward in history. And so our first stop is, of course, Appalachia. It's a vital part of the South, even though all of it's not located in the South. It is a vital part. And she takes a look at all of these different things. This book is really looking at the South in a different way. But there's a lot of beauty also in the South. Monty Perry loves the South. She loves Southern Black culture. She loves Southern food. She loves these places. But also this is a place of deep sorrow and violence. And she's rectifying those two things in her mind as she's taking you on this tour. She's, challenging particularly white people's assumptions that the South is purely a terrible place, but also that it is uniquely terrible compared to the rest of the country. But she's also communing with other Black folks in the history of Black culture in the South, the beauty that is there, the beautiful Southern cuisine that is there. And I really appreciated her very nuanced look at the South. She does not shy away from the horrific things that we know and are commonly taught about the South, but she also says, hey, but it's not just the South. Like, this is a whole thing that America as a nation needs to confront and address. And just scapegoating one particular region or even one state is not going to solve any of our problems. It's just so good. It's so good. I've read a lot of Southern literature since I moved down here, and this is one of the best books about the South that I have ever read. And it is a must read for anyone who wants to learn more about American history. If you want to know what it looks like in a contemporary setting, this. Also, a vital argument for how Maryland was historically Southern, and now it's considered Mid-Atlantic. Same with DC. Isn't that fascinating? I think it's fascinating because I'm reading like Kindred by Octavia Butler, and I'm like, why is this set in Maryland? I just didn't realize. Historical context is important, and I'm so glad we have Monty Perry. I filmed that part twice because I'm just so exuberant and excited about that book and love it and think it's so beautifully challenging and incredible. I just get so excited about it. But yeah, those are all of my favorite books of 2022. Some of them I read almost 2 years ago, but I hope that you enjoyed seeing these. If you haven't read them yet, you still obviously have time, so please definitely check them out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time for my favorite books of 2023. All right, bye friends.